This is your RLA recap. In this section, we're breaking down one of the most important GED skills, analyzing nonfiction text. These are the 6 core skills the GED expects you to master: identifying purpose, evaluating arguments, testing validity, comparing related texts, analyzing opposing viewpoints, and interpreting graphics. Then we'll look at common traps, and the final strategy you need for test day. Lesson 1. Purpose of text. Understanding why an author writes helps you understand what the text is trying to accomplish. When reading nonfiction, the first question you should ask is, why did the author write this? Writers have different purposes depending on their goals. Some texts narrate, they tell a story or describe events in chronological order. Other texts inform, they present facts, data, or explanations. Some texts persuade, they attempt to influence opinions or actions. Others entertain, they aim to amuse or emotionally engage the reader. Let's examine an example. This paragraph presents statistics and research about coffee consumption. Because it presents factual information without giving advice, the purpose is to inform. Now imagine a sentence is added recommending readers reduce caffeine intake. This recommendation changes the author's intent. Now the paragraph becomes persuasive. On the GED, identifying purpose is often the first step before analyzing arguments or tone. Lesson 2. Evaluating the effectiveness of an argument. An argument is not a fight. It is a position supported by evidence. Every effective argument includes a conclusion and evidence that supports it. Words like therefore, for these reasons, or it follows that often signal the conclusion. Let's examine the plastic straw example. First, identify the claim. The writer argues that plastic straw bans are a smart and necessary step. That is the main conclusion. Now, what evidence supports that claim? The statistic that over 500 million plastic straws are used daily, many polluting oceans. That data strengthens the argument, but there is also an unstated assumption. The writer assumes that when public behavior harms ecosystems, government intervention is justified. If that assumption were false, the argument would weaken. So to evaluate an argument's effectiveness, always identify the claim, the evidence, and the logical bridge connecting them. Lesson 3. Validity of arguments. In Lesson 2, you learned how arguments are built. Now we ask something deeper. Is the reasoning actually valid? An argument can have a clear claim and evidence and still be logically flawed. Let's analyze this argument carefully. First, separate the facts from the conclusion. The facts are simple. Customers dropped, and a new shopping complex opened. That is all we know. Now look at the conclusion. The writer claims the new complex caused the decline. But notice the logic jump. The drop happened after the complex opened. After does not automatically mean because. Timing alone does not prove causation. To test validity, ask, could something else explain the decline? If road construction made downtown inaccessible, or if seasonal patterns reduced traffic, then the conclusion weakens. This is called a false cause assumption, confusing correlation with causation. A valid argument must eliminate reasonable alternative explanations. On the GED, you may read 2 texts that discuss the same subject. Your task is not only to understand each passage individually, but to compare and synthesize them. Now let's apply this method to a real example and see how 2 texts can approach the same topic in different ways. First, identify the shared topic. Both texts focus on a proposed law limiting teen gaming hours. Notice they are not discussing video games in general. They are discussing a specific ordinance. Next, compare purpose and tone. The news story reports the proposal neutrally. The opinion letter criticizes the proposal and questions government authority. One informs, the other argues. Synthesis means combining ideas from both texts. The law aims to promote health and reduce loitering. Critics argue it restricts freedom and assumes teens are irresponsible. To answer questions correctly, Always identify the shared topic, compare tone and purpose, and synthesize ideas from both passages. Lesson 5. Texts with opposing arguments. In this lesson, the two texts do not simply relate, they directly disagree. First, identify each claim. One writer argues plastic packaging is efficient and necessary. The other argues it is harmful and unsustainable. Next, analyze the evidence. The first focuses on efficiency and innovation. The second focuses on environmental damage and recycling failure. Then, examine assumptions. One assumes efficiency justifies continued use. The other assumes environmental harm outweighs economic benefits. Finally, evaluate strength. Which argument provides stronger evidence? Which addresses counterarguments more directly? In opposing texts, your job is not to agree, but to evaluate reasoning. In this lesson, we're moving beyond text alone. On the GED, you will often see a passage paired with a graphic, such as a chart, diagram, or table. Some questions focus on the text, some focus on the graphic, others require both. First, identify the shared topic. In this example, the passage discusses changes in employment settings, especially the growth of remote work. The chart next to it breaks down percentages of different work arrangements. Both the text and the graphic are addressing the same subject: how people are working in today's economy. Now ask a critical question. Is the graphic supporting the text, or is it adding new information? In this case, the passage already mentions specific percentages: 20% fully remote, 25% hybrid, 40% fully on-site, 10% gig work, and 5% self-employed. The chart visually reinforces those same numbers. So here, the graphic is primarily supporting and clarifying the information already presented. But this is where many students make mistakes. They glance at the chart and assume it confirms the passage. On the GED, you must verify that connection. If the passage states that 20% work fully remote, the chart must reflect that same proportion. If the chart shows something different, that difference may be the key to the question. Never assume, always cross-check. The graphic also allows you to see relationships more clearly. For example, while only 20% work fully remote, if you combine remote, hybrid, and self-employed workers, that equals 50% of the workforce spending at least some time working outside a traditional office. That broader insight may not be directly stated in the passage, but the graphic makes it easier to notice. This is how strong readers use visuals to deepen understanding. In this module, you learned how to identify purpose, evaluate arguments, test validity, compare texts, analyze opposing views, and integrate graphics. On the GED, strong reading is not about speed, it's about strategy. Apply these tools every time you read. Continue to the next module and keep building your skills.